It is time to talk tech with Carmi Levy, who is CTV's tech analyst, and he joins us on the line. Good afternoon, Carmi.
Good afternoon, Sue. So great to be with you.
You too. So, funny that we're talking today because big news, I guess, in the tech world, and this is Canada's, let's call it a social media ban for kids under 16. What do we know about that?
Yeah, so they're calling it, known as Bill C-34, the Digital Safety Act. And basically what it does is it tries to pick up where the Online Harms Act, which didn't quite make it into law before the last parliamentary session ended, kind of left off. And so what it does is it learns from what happened in Australia. Australia, of course, in December became the first country in the world to introduce a social media ban for kids under 16. So it kind of takes that experience, and at least the hope is that it makes it better. So what it will do is it'll prevent kids from under 16 from registering to create a social media account. So they won't be allowed on the platforms. It'll also give the technology companies that if they introduce sufficient safeguards into their platforms, in other words, change the design so that they're safer, it will allow them to apply to have an exemption from this law. So, we use the term ban, but it's a little different than what we've seen in Australia and other countries because there's a lot of room for these companies to introduce new features, and then basically none of this applies. Right. What's interesting, they're also targeting artificial intelligence companies, so OpenAI's ChatGPT, Google's Gemini, and there's no age restriction on these, but they are saying that these companies are going to have what they call a duty of care. They're going to have to behave more responsibly, build better protections or what they like to call guardrails into their technology. So, for example, if a child starts talking about suicide or a mental health crisis or something like that, that it would stop the conversation and it would initiate some kind of reporting process. It would prevent kids from going down rabbit holes that can, in some cases, get them into trouble. Yeah. And so what it does is, unlike other laws in other countries, it actually forces the tech companies to be more responsible than they have. And I think in that respect, it's not perfect. I don't believe bans actually work, but as a starting point to fix this problem of this crisis that we have around kids using social media and AI tools, it's a reasonable place to start, and it's got a lot of people kind of gathered around the table ready to provide feedback on this bill before it becomes law.
So we've been talking about this today on the show, and we've had a lot of pushback from people saying, and I'm going to read you a text as an example, is what are the implications for CSIS and the Canadian government using this as a backdoor to monitor every single person within Canada's communication, which is a concern we've heard from every time the government tries to put up these kind of so-called safeguard walls.
Yeah, and that's a very difficult balance to achieve, and it's a reasonable question to ask. Is every time the government says, we want to tighten security and tighten digital safety for kids and anyone of any age, that means that someone's going to have to collect a lot of data, right? They're going to have to institute what's called age verification to make sure that you are as old as you say you are, because without age verification, none of this works. Well, in order to do that, you have to collect government ID. You have to collect information on those individuals. You may have to get facial recognition and other sort of identifying data. You'll have to collect information from their phones, perhaps, and all that information, put it in a giant pile, becomes a very lovely target for cyber criminals, and also makes it easy for governments to say, hey, we've got all this data. Let's use it for something else.
Yeah, Big Brother.
Exactly. So it opens the door to that risk. And certainly that's one of the reasons why earlier attempts to pass legislation like this failed, because the government kept overreaching, kept including clauses that, allowed them to collect data that was way beyond the requirements of the law. And even though they said at the time, we would never actually act on it, we would never, use the information in that way, it's just for this purpose, full well, if you include that clause in the law, the potential for abuse is there. And so those concerns are still valid now, and we will still have to discuss them before this thing becomes a law.
And so that seems to be a long away process, because to your point, these things have been stopped in the past because of government overreach and other things. And it looks like, I keep saying the devil's in the details, but it's really, we don't know much about how they intend to enact this, because it's not presumably easy.
Yeah, I mean, I read through the bill, and I did a bit of a deep dive on it to understand what it was, and it was shockingly devoid of detail. It was written at a very high level. It doesn't even specify which platform. So is it Facebook? Is it TikTok? Nope, doesn't say, doesn't mention them by name, doesn't actually define what harm is. A lot of definitions clearly not there. I think the intent is to fill them in as the feedback process goes along, but it is very deliberately vague. And I think I think they're hoping to kind of have stakeholders provide that over time, that they don't want to be critiqued for it. But at the same time, it means that it could end up being anything. And ultimately, that's, that you want a law that's specific, and you also want a law that adapts to the technology as the technology continues to develop. And the timeline that we're on, they're not even committing to it. But based on analysis that I've seen, first of all, they introduced it right before the summer break, so now it's just going to sit there. And it could take, even by the time it becomes law, from that moment forward, which could be later this year, next year, it'll be 18 months after that to establish this Digital Safety Commission, the national regulator for digital platforms, and get all of those pieces together as well. So we're looking at years before this could potentially be a law that is, enacted on the ground and being enforced. And so meanwhile, kids are still using these technologies, still getting into trouble. There's this kind of gap that keeps getting wider.
So is this a PR exercise?
To a certain extent, yes, because ever since Australia introduced its law, there's been just dozens of countries that have kind of been lining up saying, we're going to introduce our own.
Yeah.
And so there's this global trend toward introducing bans, and I don't think Canada wanted to be seen as out of step. Of course, at the same time, the risk here is they're pushing back against big tech at a time when we're also negotiating on trade with the U.S.
Exactly. And most of these companies are based in the U.S.
That's exactly it. And so, Donald Trump and his administration, they keep talking about irritants and annoyances and how Canada is getting on their nerves. This could very well be another kind of point of contention. But I was really encouraged because Minister Mark Miller said, kids' safety is not negotiable, and we're not going to proceed with legislation like this because of it. It's too important. And so good on him for at least recognizing that regardless of the political context, this kind of thing has to be done.
All right. Well, I know we've taken up a lot of time talking about this, but I feel I really wanted your perspective on that, and especially the privacy concerns. But I'd like to just quickly get to this Instagram story because it seems like on topic a bit. Because, we're talking about these big companies, platforms, ability, desire to monitor themselves, looking like maybe not.
Yeah, they certainly don't. And so what they've done is they've instituted tighter controls over, they're going to be monitoring the kinds of content that teens are either posting or interacting with. And they're going to start putting limits in place to prevent impacts on their mental health. And so they're adding anxiety, weightlifting, nutrition onto that list of things that are triggers. That if, for example, you're searching for anxiety, or you're looking at reels that deal with anxiety and have those in their hashtags and in their content, that will be a trigger, and the algorithm will then dial that down so that as a teenager you won't be able to see that going forward. It prevents kids from going down that kind of rabbit hole where they just keep seeing the same thing over and over and over. It reinforces negative feelings about themselves and could turn into a full-blown mental health crisis. And you're right. They're doing this because they have to, because they're being sued both in the U.S. and in Canada and around the world for not doing enough to protect kids. This is, to a certain extent, a PR exercise. But you know what? As a parent, I'll take it. I'll still be involved in social media oversight with my kids. It's still a conversation that we will always be there to have. However, and I'm not going to leave it to Mark Zuckerberg to decide what's good or not for my kid. But I'm glad to have the platforms at least their design is starting to move in the right direction. It's a little bit safer, a little bit less wide open, Wild West.
So maybe we don't need legislation, Carmi. We need litigation. Right?
Yeah, nothing like a good lawsuit to threaten big tech into submission. Not a bad idea.
Exactly. All right, we'll end on that to a somewhat cynical note. Carmi, great talking to you. Thank you.
iHeartRadio is throwing it back.
2010s, the decade.
To the days days of huge hits and unforgettable anthems. A non-stop stream of the biggest and best.
Drake, Rihanna, Beyonce, Katy, Gaga, The Weeknd,
And more. All your decade-defining favorites all in one place.
Hi, it's Katy Perry.
Hey, it's Bruno Mars.
This is Kesha.
Find 2010's The Decade on the free iHeartRadio app. Preset the station so it's always one tap away.